in Hebrew poetry, linguistics, metaphor studies, cultural studies, trauma studies, pain. So you see, there's a lot of commonalities with the things we have been discussing this morning, but now from a biblical perspective. We have the pleasure to listen to a talk with the title, Do True Justice, Do Kindness and Mercy Towards One Another. That's a quote. The Entanglement of Justice and Mercy in Biblical Prophecy. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this event. I was very happy to participate in this conference and to receive this invitation for many reasons. Certainly, the Peace Day is a particularly important day given our troubled times. But one of the things that made me very excited when I received this invitation, it was because I knew that it would be in honor of our dear Professor Johan de Tavernier, to whom I would like to express my profound gratitude for all your work. And thank you, everybody, for coming today. So, biblical prophets are widely recognized as some of the most distinctive, fascinating, and perturbing protagonists of ancient Israel's religion. Prophets in ancient Israel were considered mediators between Yahweh and his people, standing between the divine judgment of a history on the one hand and Israel's many infidelities on the other. Prophecy was by no means an exclusive prerogative of Israel. The phenomenon of prophecy was indeed widespread in the ancient Near East. Yet, while ancient Near Eastern sources provide us with important information to better understand the phenomenon of prophecy in the ancient Near East, they also make it clear that no other civilization in the entire ancient Near East left us a wealth of prophetic texts even vaguely comparable to biblical prophecy with respect to aesthetic value and theological depth. It does not come as a surprise, therefore, that scholarly research on biblical prophecy is restless. In 1962, Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the leading Jewish theologians and philosophers of the 20th century, wrote a very insightful book entitled The Prophets, which included an engrossing chapter on the tight interconnection between justice and mercy in biblical prophecy. He concluded that chapter summarizing the prophet's message as follows. God rules the world by justice and compassion or love. These two ways are not divergent, but rather complementary. For it is out of compassion that justice is administered. He would be unjust to his own nature were he to act injustice without being compassionate. Now, it is of course extremely risky to summarize in only a few words everything the ancient Israel's prophets have thought and said, especially when it comes to very dense concepts such as justice, mercy, and their relationship. But Heschel was certainly right. In several prophetic texts, justice and mercy are like the two sides of the same coin, and that coin is telling of who Yahweh is and what his people is expected to be. Today, I would like to focus on the entanglement of justice and mercy in two prophetic texts, Hosea chapter 2, verses 21-22, and Zechariah chapter 7, verse 9. But before reading and commenting on this text, a really short, simple explicatio terminorum is necessary, which was already introduced by Professor Lemelin. Thank you very much. In biblical Hebrew, the conceptual domains justice and love are expressed through a number of different lexemes, each of which means something very different, although it is true that on some occasions we struggle to neatly distinguish the difference in meaning between some of them. We're not going to see all the words possible, but we will only see 3 word pairs which are important then to read and properly understand Hosea and Zechariah. The first word pair is mishpat and tzedakah. They both belong to the conceptual domain justice, but they profile different aspects. To put it simply, the term mishpat, which is usually translated as justice, has mainly to do with the juridical and judicial levels of justice. In the Hebrew Bible, mishpat may refer to the determination of what is legally right, and therefore the determination of rights, rules, the act of judgment, and the quality of behaving or being according to the law. Tzedakah, as Professor Benedict Lemelin has just said, is something completely different, I would say. It's something else. Tzedakah, which we may want to translate as righteousness, is a relational concept, in the sense that it refers to a relationship between at least 2 individuals who are righteous towards each other if they act according to what their relationship requires. In other words, being righteous is not a mere matter of observing legal norms. Rather, being righteous is a matter of recognizing the other person for what the other person is and needs, and our role in the relationship with the other, whether the other is Yahweh or other members of the community. So, I would say that whereas mishpat has mainly to do with the norms, in the practice of tzedakah, the relationship itself is the norm. Of course, there is no intrinsic opposition between mishpat and tzedakah, at least in the Hebrew Bible. On the contrary, we may say that in the Hebrew Bible, tzedakah is the overriding principle of mishpat. On the one hand, living according to mishpat helps the member of a community to become righteous towards one another. But on the other hand, it's not real justice if that justice is not grounded in and leads to righteousness, tzedakah. And this is why the 2 terms very often occur together. The second word pair contains 2 words belonging to the conceptual domain love, the Hebrew terms for kindness, chesed, and mercy, rachamim. Again, these terms are semantically quite different, although they do convey ideas that are interrelated. Chesed is a term that designates an intervention in favor of someone and expresses what in English we would convey through terms such as kindness, goodness, generosity, magnanimity. Rachamim has more to do with one's response to the other person's suffering in order to alleviate the other person's distress and misfortune. And that's why rachamim can be translated as mercy or compassion. Finally, the third word, pair, emunah and emet, two terms that are clearly connected not only in sound, but also in meaning. They both convey the idea of firmness, stability, duration, and therefore can be both translated as faithfulness and reliability. Now, what is important to underscore here is that emet also means truth, as we will see, and especially emunah is not so much an abstract quality, but it's something extremely concrete, a way of acting which grows out of inner stability. Now, why am I saying all this? Because these pairs of words occur in two texts that I'm going to comment on. Hosea 2, and I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in tzedakah and mishpat, in chesed and rachamim, and I will betroth you in faithfulness, in emunah, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. And then Zechariah, thus says Yahweh of hosts, do emet mishpat, true justice, do chesed and rachamim towards one another. So let us see Hosea. Very little is known about the historical persona of Hosea, but thanks to the heading of the book, we know that Hosea was active in the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century before Common Era. His oracles were later reworked and collected in the book that now we call the Book of Hosea. Hosea 2:21-22 belong to the first section of the book, from chapter 1 to chapter 3, which is held together by the theme of the troubled marriage between Hosea and his wife Gomer. According to the book's story, Gomer betrayed her husband on multiple occasions and even had children with other men. After publicly accusing his wife of adultery and punishing her severely, Hosea tries to reconquer his wife and commits himself to a renewed relationship. Now, all this is presented as a metaphor or an allegory of the relationship between Yahweh and Israel since the very outset of the book. Throughout chapters 1-3, Hosea and Gomer on the one hand, and Yahweh and Israel on the other, they intertwine and shape a sort of figure-ground image. And as in all figure-ground images, sometimes it's very difficult to understand what refers to Israel and Yahweh, what refers to Hosea and his wife. But equally unclear is the nature of Israel's offense, what was wrong. Especially at the beginning of the 20th century, biblical scholars were very confident that via the metaphor, the marital, the sexual metaphor, Hosea wanted to represent ancient Israel idolatry. Scholars nowadays are much less confident, and it makes more sense, apparently, that Hosea's troubled marriage was meant to conjure up various forms of religious, political, and social transgressions. Now, after starting a trial against Gomer and Israel, inviting children to testify against their mother, Hosea/Yahweh announces his punishment against his wife, his people. Hosea, Yahweh, will make it impossible for Gomer, Israel, to reach her lovers. and the wife, the people, will be stripped naked and publicly humiliated, as we can read in these very disturbing verses. Therefore, I will turn back and take away my grain in its time and my wine in its season, and reclaim my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness. Nakedness is a Hebrew euphemism to say female genitals. Now I will expose her nakedness in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her from my hand. Now, this is only one of the many texts of the Hebrew Bible using images of violence against women to portray Yahweh's punishment of his people. Prophetic texts certainly raise serious ethical problems for the modern readers, especially if the readers attribute authoritative value to biblical text. In the attempt to build a more tolerant and just society, how should we respond to authoritative texts that conflict with our ideas of tolerance and justice? As I see it, saying that these are just metaphors is not enough, because metaphors are not innocuous literary devices. On the contrary, metaphors can hurt. As Renita Weems argued in her brilliant work entitled Battered Love, Marriage, Sex, and Violence in the Hebrew Prophets, metaphors matter because they are sometimes our first lessons in prejudice, bigotry, stereotyping, and in marginalizing others, even if only in our minds. They deserve our scrutiny because they are intrinsic to the way we live and shape reality. Readers are affected by what they read. Now, likewise, saying that this is just the product of ancient patriarchal societies is not enough from an ethical perspective, I think, if this obvious observation is not accompanied by severe criticism of both these texts and the patriarchal conceptual structures that still inform our communities. The prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible, as many other ancient texts, can certainly be inspirational and even a source of fundamental human values. Yet this is only one part of the story. The other part of the story is that they also reflect and convey values and ideas that most of us would nowadays consider despicable. Contrary to the position of those who would like to remove from the public sphere whatever is disturbing and controversial, I think that the appalling violence of the prophetic books should not prevent us from reading this text. On the contrary, I wonder whether we should read this text even more, standing in front of them as in front of a mirror in which the reader is allowed to honestly observe and criticize all the violence and injustice that belong to the world of the text, but also a mirror that reflects the violence and injustice that, whether blatantly or in disguise, are still at work in the world of the reader, namely our world. In this way, biblical prophecy can still be an invaluable source for social critique, which was one of its core characteristics, and not in spite of, but paradoxically, thanks to its troublesome language. Now, within the logic of the text, the violent reaction of Hosea, Yahweh, seems to have a pedagogic intent, namely convincing Gomer, Israel, of her misconduct and re-establishing the relationship with Hosea, Yahweh. What follows, indeed, is Hosea's attempt to reseduce the adulterous wife to make her fall in love again with the husband and renew their marriage. Hosea 2:21-22 is part of Yahweh's promises about the future, a future that is 3 times pictured as a betrothal. He will betroth Israel in righteousness and justice, in kindness and mercy, so that Israel will finally know Yahweh. We find here a very interesting symmetrical construction, which a pair of terms, forever and faithfulness, expressing stability and unflagging commitment, envelops the words righteousness and justice and kindness and mercy. Yahweh envisions a future in which his relationship with Israel is finally marked by righteous justice and compassionate kindness. The question arises as to whom these attributes will belong. Now, following the metaphor of the betrothal, it seems that righteous justice and compassionate kindness are the gifts of the groom, Yahweh, for the bride, Israel. In Hosea 2:21-22, the woman or the people that was stripped naked in front of everybody because of her sins, one day will be covered and clothed by Yahweh in righteous justice and compassionate kindness, probably in the sense that she will finally be able to live in righteous justice and compassionate kindness. The appeal to the practice of justice and mercy is indeed a constant refrain in the prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible. Whoever reads the prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible immediately understands that much of biblical prophecy is a fierce accusation of all possible forms of social injustice and lack of care of the vulnerable ones. Quoting again from the prophets by Heschel, the sort of crimes and even the amount of delinquency that filled the prophets of Israel with dismay do not go beyond that which we regard as normal, as typical ingredients of social dynamics. To us, a single act of injustice, cheating in business, exploitation of the poor, is slight. To the prophets, a disaster. To us, injustice is injurious to the welfare of the people. To the prophets, it is a death blow to existence. To us, an episode, to them, a catastrophe, a threat to the world. Their breathless impatience with injustice may strike us as hysteria. We ourselves witness continually acts of injustice, manifestations of hypocrisy, falsehood, outrage, misery. But we rarely grow indignant or overly excited. To the prophets, even a minor injustice assumes cosmic proportions. Now, in Hosea 2:21-22, Yahweh envisions a future in which he will finally make his bride Israel capable of justice and mercy. Yet something more seems to be at stake here. Yahweh will cover and clothe Israel in righteous justice and compassionate kindness, also in the sense that Yahweh himself will be a different God. A God that will finally be able to hold together justice and mercy, overcoming his own violent jealousy, that violent jealousy that he has released throughout chapter 2. As American biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann wrote in his essay, The Recovering God of Hosea, the outcome of Hosea's characterization is a God who is a recovering agent of violence, who has a deep violence in the marrow of personhood, a memory of violence regretted, and many lapses back into violence, but a resolve to be a spouse of generosity. As is in all such recovery programs, the process is always continuing and never completed. In other words, Hosea 2:21-22 envisions a utopian future with a profound ethical transformation, not only of Israel, but first and foremost of God himself. A utopian future when an entirely new relationship between the two is created. A relationship in which Israel will recover from her misconduct on the one hand, and Yahweh will recover from his violent jealousy on the other. A relationship in which both Israel and Yahweh are bound to the practice of righteous justice and compassionate kindness. The God of Hosea and the God of the Hebrew Bible more in general is very far from being a static God full of those perfections and virtues that we human beings would like to possess. Yahweh is a God in the making, holding together righteous justice and compassionate kindness is a relational struggle for Yahweh as much as for his people. And going through this struggle is the only way that both Yahweh and his people have to become finally faithful to each other. To conclude this part, on several occasions I have used the adjective utopian to refer to the ideal condition described in the book of Hosea and to describe a dream about the future that implies a profound commitment to make sure that the mundus novus is the mundus inversus. To whom does this utopia belong? In the text, this utopia certainly belongs to the divine. It is Yahweh himself who, via the prophet, gives voice to his dream, so to speak, about the relationship with his people. Yet, what is attributed to Yahweh actually is the utopia of the intellectuals who compiled the book of Hosea after the destruction of the kingdom of the north in the 8th century. And if we assume with many scholars that the final book of Hosea took form only later, between the 6th and the 4th century, during the Persian period, another traumatic experience had occurred, the Babylonian catastrophe, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 586. We are in the Persian age at the end, and the Persian age was the period of reconstruction of Israel's social, political, and religious fabric, a period during which ancient Israel's intellectuals looked at the past in order to understand the steps to be taken in the present and build the future. In the aftermath of the Babylonian catastrophe, looking back and looking ahead served the agenda for the present. In this agenda for renovation, some word pairs stand out: righteous justice and compassionate kindness. I need some water, and you some rest, I think. Just one second. So, our second text is very different. The prophecy of Zechariah is to be situated in the just mentioned Persian period between the 5th and the 4th century, whereas the book is much later, probably Hellenistic. Now, our verse belongs to the first and older section of the book of Zechariah, chapters 1 to 8, which, after an introduction, contains 7 dreams that Zechariah had in one night. In these dreams, Zechariah sees a completely restored Jerusalem, which had recently been devastated by the Babylonians, and he envisions Jerusalem as the center of Yahweh's presence. The main aim of these dreams seems to be to convince the people we need to rebuild the temple. Now, Zechariah, that was Italian. Zechariah is much more than an enthusiastic supporter of rebuilding the temple, as we will see. After the dreams, a series of oracles follow, which constitute an interlude on spiritual renewal. All these oracles focus on the restoration of God's covenantal relationship with his people. Indeed, the climax of this section seems to be in chapter 8, verse 8, where we read, "They shall be my people, and I will be their God." Now, at some point in chapter 7, verses 2-3, we read of a certain delegation of men from Bethel. Bethel was an important worship center. A delegation of men from Bethel inquiring about particular religious practices. Now, the people of Bethel had sent Sharezer and Regemelech and their men to seek the favor of Yahweh and to ask the priests of the house of Yahweh of hosts and the prophets, "Should I mourn and practice abstinence in the 5th month, as I have done for so many years?" Now, the delegation from Bethel asks about a ritual practice of collective mourning that they have been performing for years, probably since the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586. These collective ritual practices of mourning were widespread in the ancient Near East, not only to process a collective trauma after the destruction of cities and temples, but also when people were about to rebuild their cities and temples. So, since this is what Zechariah is aiming at, rebuilding the temple, the question of this delegation makes sense. Should we continue doing what we have been doing over the last 70 years, they are asking. In verse 2, we find the phrase, "to seek favor," which is a stock phrase in the Hebrew Bible, meaning to seek relief from the anger of Yahweh. This suggests that the delegation from Bethel is not merely asking for liturgical direction. Their request is rather a muted plea that God would bring an end to his anger and to the period of discipline and mourning. Now, this is how Zechariah replies. "Then the word of Yahweh of hosts came to me, say to all the people of the land and the priests, when you fasted and lamented in the 5th month and in the 7th for these 70 years, was it for me that you fasted? And when you eat and when you drink, do you not eat and drink only for yourselves? Were not these the prophets, the words that Yahweh proclaimed by the former prophets? Thus says Yahweh of hosts, do true justice, do kindness and mercy towards one another. Do not oppress the widow, the orphan, the alien, or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another." Now, Zechariah answers a question as nobody should never do, with more questions. In verses 4 and 6. Why have you been fasting, really? What is your motive? Is it for yourselves or for Yahweh? At the beginning of this pericope, the heart of the matter concerning fasting is motive and attitude. A fast should, in theory, be an outward sign of an inner disposition of humility and a heart turned toward God. But is this the way the people is really fasting? Asks Zechariah. Of course, these are rhetorical questions. And one of the main distinguishing features of rhetorical questions is that they are not questions at all, because rhetorical questions are statements in disguise. So Zechariah is not really asking questions, is he? He's making a point. You are not fasting in the right way, he's saying. You are just a group of self-centered hypocrites. Now, the prophetic interrogation is not over, and through another rhetorical question in verse 7, and then through his own synthesis of previous prophecies, in verse 9, Zechariah explains what is the core of all the words that Yahweh has been saying unsuccessfully through the prophets. Zechariah is right. The former prophets did constantly teach this lesson. Do true justice, do kindness and mercy towards one another. You find in different ways, different formulations of the same teaching in Hosea, in Amos, in Micah, in Isaiah. Now, in the aftermath of the Babylonian trauma, when ancient Israel's community was trying to bounce back and rebuild itself, for Zechariah, it's not individual and collective piety that can keep the fabric of society secure and on which the city, the temple, and the community can be rebuilt. Rather, it is through the ethical practice of right judgment, honesty, integrity, compassion, faithfulness, in one word, in two words, justice and mercy. Now, it is worth noting that the initial imperative, do true justice, is addressing first and foremost the leaders of the community. The expression do true justice and similar expressions occur throughout the book of Ezekiel, for example, exactly to ask the leaders to behave, to judge the community according to righteousness. So the instructions in Zechariah, of course, the second part of the verse then is extended to everybody. That the instructions in Zechariah 7:9 are crucial is suggested by the worth noting switch from prose to poetry. Whereas until verse 8, and then starting with verse 10, the text is written in prose, when it comes to verse 9, you have the switch from prose to poetry. Now, this interruption of prose via poetry is typical of the Hebrew Bible. To mention only a few examples, we find it, for instance, in the story of creation. It's prose, 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 prose. And then when it comes to the creation of male and female, it switches into poetry. And then it continues with prose. Or in Exodus, prose, prose, prose. And then at some point, it switches into poetry and they introduce the song of Moses or Miriam, as you want to call it. Now, this is a widespread strategy through which the scribes responsible for compiling biblical books wanted to add gravitas to certain verses. It's like a sudden drum roll, a sudden drum beat to catch the audience's attention and say, hey, pay attention, this is what matters the most. Now, Zechariah 7:9 is particularly powerful because of its poetic parallel structure. In the 80s and the 90s, biblical scholar James Kugel and literary critic Robert Alter pointed out that there are different kinds of parallel structures in the Hebrew Bible, but they all share a general principle, namely that the second line tends to be more than the first line, in the sense that the second line makes the first line either clearer or more concrete, more focused, more tangible, or all these things together. Here in 7:9, for instance, we have a general statement in the first line, do true justice, and then its clarification. What does it mean? Its concrete articulation in the second line, do kindness and mercy. Now, in line of the relationship between these two lines, it's clear that from the perspective of Zechariah, mutual kindness and mercy are neither opposed to nor different from justice in the sense of a system of rules. Rather, kindness and mercy are the only possible articulation of justice, without which justice can still be justice, but not true justice. What makes justice true justice is kindness and mercy. So, as I said at the beginning, kindness, chesed, is a term that designates a concrete intervention of benevolence, generosity in favor of someone. It does not have to do with feelings, but it has to do with doing. Indeed, it is often accompanied by the verb to do, as in Zechariah, and it usually refers to Yahweh's covenantal love, his commitment to act with faithful, everlasting generosity in favor of his people. In Zechariah 7:9, the instruction given to the people, and especially to the leaders, to do kindness is in the end an instruction to act like God does. The word rachamim, as I said at the beginning, has more to do with one's response to other people's suffering in order to alleviate their distress. And in the Hebrew Bible, it appears 11 times, and except here, it always applies to Yahweh. It's Yahweh who has rachamim. All this suggests that according to Zechariah, the program of renewal and reconstruction after the catastrophe is not based on behaviors of piety and devotion, nor is it based on good feelings and pretty words. The program of renewal and reconstruction is based on what throughout the history of Christian theology and spirituality has often been called the imitatio Dei. Now, the concreteness of this program is further specified by what follows. Do not oppress the widow, the orphan, the alien, or the poor, and do not devise evil in every society and not devise evil in your hearts against one another. There is a group of people in every society that requires special care. They are the unfortunate, the helpless, the disenfranchised ones. Again, this is already in previous prophets. Is Zechariah also suggesting that it is only by observing the rules that one can properly exercise kindness and mercy? After all, there is a kind of merciful attitude that can easily generate into a sort of laissez-faire, which in turn can become an accomplice of all possible socially destructive behaviors. Mercy without the administration and the observation of rules could make our societies a living hell. Now, I do not think that this is the point that Zechariah is making here. In Zechariah 7:9, we are dealing with something else. Zechariah is trying to establish that in order to reform and rebuild the community, justice is what really matters, and kindness and mercy are the hermeneutical principle par excellence of what constitutes true justice. Zechariah's teaching will resound in what centuries later another prophet in ancient Judaism, Jesus of Nazareth, taught to his disciples when he was dealing with the establishment, the intellectuals, the religious leaders, and their oppressive obsession with the observation of rules. It suffices to mention Jesus' words in Matthew. You are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels, for I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. The apple clearly did not fall very far from the tree, at least with respect to the entanglement of justice and mercy. Let me conclude. Hosea and Zechariah Zechariah were active in two very different historical periods. Hosea was active in the 8th century before Common Era, and Zechariah 300 years later. The historical period when the book of Hosea and the first part of Zechariah were put together, however, was probably the same, the Persian period. This was a period of enormous difficulties. Everything needed to be rebuilt. Not only the city of Jerusalem and the temple, not only the entire political, social, economic systems, but also the very identity of Israel, their social cohesion, let alone their faith, which had been profoundly jeopardized by the Babylonian trauma. This was the period when most of what eventually would become the Hebrew Bible started to be put together, mainly in order to provide answers, some sense for the nonsensical, a shared past, to provide a shared collective memory that would be able to shed light on the present and the future. The prophecies of Hosea and Zechariah and what they say about the entanglement of justice and mercy need to be read against this historical background. Now, will Yahweh's dream in Hosea one day come true? Will Zechariah's program of restoration one day be followed? The answers to these questions are, as always, in the hands of the readers. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Danilo Verde, for this inspiring lecture and all the insights about the terminology and the meaning and the ideas the text could bring us today. So thank you. Then it's time for the next speaker, who is our very international guest coming from the US. That's Dr. Megan Clark, who is Associate Professor of Moral Theology at St. John's University in New York. She has been a Fulbright Scholar in Hekima Institute for Peace Studies and International Relations in Nairobi, Kenya. She has been conducting fieldwork in different countries, Sudan, Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania. She has stayed in Durham as a research fellow at the Centre for Catholic Studies, UK. And in 2022, I think that's very important to mention, she was assistant coordinator for the North American Working Group of an international project of the Holy See, which is called Doing Theology from the Existential Peripheries. It's a project of the Migrant and Refugees section of the Dicastery for the Promotion of the Integral Human Development of the Holy See. So we'll hear to what Dr. Clark has to tell us about charity and justice this time. So different words, but it's each time about these similar tensions. And she will speak about this in reference to the Catholic social thought of the Church. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I am not using PowerPoint, although part of me almost asked to leave up the section from Matthew 25, as in a sense it, what I'm going to be laying out today in a way is essentially proposing that what Catholic social teaching does is ask us to see Matthew 25 as about charity or caritas and justice always at the same time. But we have a tendency often to emphasize one or the other. And in a way, I hope this will build on the last presentation on how, where we heard about how to do true justice. This means that it has to involve kindness and mercy. To have charity or love, or as we understand it as the umbrella, caritas, we must have justice. Charity, or caritas or charity, is at the heart of the gospel. And yet despite this, it's a word that Christians hear and use often as we talk. It isn't something that gets a lot of sustained attention or talked about as an umbrella within contemporary culture any longer. We no longer talk about the virtue of charity or caritas. And this is one of the things that particularly was of concern to the late Pope Benedict. Concerned with, as he put it, the ways charity has been and continues to be misconstrued and emptied of meaning, he chose caritas as the central theme for both his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, or God is Love, and his first social encyclical, or contribution, his main contribution to Catholic social teaching, Caritas in Veritate, or Charity in Truth. I highlight the titles as well because of the ways in which these layers of what we're talking about when we talk about charity. In doing so, Pope Benedict XVI brought renewed attention and created considerable debate around the relationship between charity and justice, especially as it relates to the mission of the Church in contemporary society. The two are inextricably linked, as Caritas in Veritate recognizes. For if we love others with charity, then first of all, we are just towards them. And to desire the common good and strive towards it is a requirement of justice and of charity, says Caritas in Veritate. This approach stirred significant debate concerning how do we put these together, in part because, as I'll address in a minute, of how they got framed in Deus Caritas Est. Since then, Pope Francis frequently links justice, love, and peace. In Fratelli Tutti, he notes, quote, "Without charity, we may possess perhaps only apparent virtues, incapable of sustaining life in common. And that our very sense of belonging in today's consumeristic world is tied to our struggling together for justice." Francis develops Catholic social teaching's understanding of charity or caritas to focus on how this includes political love. In this presentation, I want to look at the relationship between these two central virtues within Catholic social teaching, charity and justice, focusing on the late Pope Benedict XVI and Francis, on how this gives us a vision of two virtues that always have to be held together, both personally and institutionally. So I start with how these relate in the late Pope Benedict XVI. As I started to mention, caritas is love, but it is a love that goes beyond any sense of emotion. It is lived, practiced. It is a virtue. And for Thomas Aquinas, this virtue was ultimately directed not just at union with God, but friendship with God. However, in our common conversation and contemporary culture, charity is often used not to refer to the broad Christian tradition and virtue, but in the narrower practice of almsgiving. Thus, what Aquinas identifies as but one practice of the virtue of charity becomes the entire frame, leaving Christian charity as highly individualized, limited, and largely divorced from any discussion of justice. It's about giving to the poor. After an extended meditation on the philosophical and theological nature of love, Deus Caritas Est examines the, quote, unbreakable bond between love of God and love of neighbor. Benedict explains, only my readiness to encounter my neighbor and show him love makes me sensitive to God as well. Only if I serve my neighbor can my eyes be open to what God does for me and how much God loves me. Thus, Benedict turns to the caritas, the practice of love by the church, as the ancient diaconia laid out in Acts of the Apostles. Moreover, he affirms that, quote, the parable of the Good Samaritan remains as a standard which imposes universal love towards the needy whom we encounter by chance. This understanding of charity, notes the Jesuit theologian Tom Massaro, generally connotes direct service to those in need, as exemplified by the traditional corporal works of mercy. Such acts of kindness and compassion are voluntary in nature, springing from a heart moved with pity at the plight of others. While Deus Caritas Est was lauded for its treatment of charity, it created significant debate and controversy for its somewhat narrow, and I would argue problematic, interpretation of its relationship to justice. Focusing almost entirely on political justice and the state, Deus Caritas Est emphasized that the Church's concern for justice and identified it as an indirect duty, not a direct one, placing justice and politics as primarily the responsibility of the laity, while charity was the primary responsibility of the Church. Charles Murphy explained that, or interpreted this as, for Benedict, quote, as a faithful disciple of Augustine, he sets forth forcefully these distinctions between charity and justice, church and state, the heavenly city and the earthly one. Even though he also asserts that the church cannot and should not remain on the sidelines in matters of social justice, it comes out as secondary. From Deus Caritas Est, then, charity emerges as the primary and constitutive aspect of the church's mission as an organized activity and with a somewhat vague relationship to justice outside of what the laity are supposed to do. Some of you here may have remembered the way in which there was a very strong reaction, particularly among ethicists and those involved in Catholic and Christian social movements, to the way in which the end of Deus Caritas Est talked about justice as not being as central. Almost as if directly responding to that debate, Caritas in Veritate offered a more systematic explication on the practical aspects of charity and its relationship to justice and solidarity in contemporary society. The commitment to justice and the ministry of charity are inseparable. Caritas in Veritate explains, in contrast to some of Deus Caritas Est, that I cannot give what is mine to the other without first giving him what pertains to him in justice. If we love others with charity, then first of all, we are just towards them. Charity always manifests God's love in human relationships. As well, it gives theological and salvific value for justice in the world. It's from Caritas in Veritate 6. Justice in our human relations, then, is a precondition for actually living and practicing charity. I cannot love my neighbor if I am unjust towards them or complicit in their oppression. Both charity and justice are required for healthy relationships with God and neighbor. In addition, both are commanded and graced actions. Active work for the common good, then, is a requirement of both charity and justice. Caritas in Veritate notes that the more we strive to secure a common good corresponding to the real needs of our neighbors, the more effectively we love them. Practically, Benedict XVI used the economic life and the global financial crisis that had just happened to offer an example of a necessary relationship between justice and charity, and then this can be extended to include solidarity. Developing his understanding of charity into a theology of gift and a principle of gratuitousness, he explains that because it is a gift received by everyone, charity in truth is a force that builds community. It brings all people together without imposing barriers or limits. The unity of the human race, he says, a fraternal communion transcending every barrier, is called into being by the word of God, who is love. Building upon this, solidarity and reciprocity should exist within economic activity, and that's a big push that happens in Caritas in Veritate. From this, then justice must be applied to every phase of economic activity because, as Benedict says, this is always concerned with man and his needs. Turns out, the more we get into it, justice is just as central to the Church's social mission. Pulling together his application to economic life and further complicating the relationship between justice, solidarity, and charity, he goes on to state, and I apologize for not thinking to have a PowerPoint because this is a longer quote. In the global era, economic activity cannot prescind from gratuitousness, which fosters and disseminates solidarity and responsibility for justice and the common good among different economic players. Solidarity is first and foremost a sense of responsibility on the part of everyone with regard to everyone, and it cannot, therefore, be merely relegated to the state. While in the past it was possible to argue that justice had to come first and gratuitousness could follow afterwards as a complement, today it is clear that without gratuitousness, there can be no justice in the first place. And that's the end of the long quote, which is from Caritas in Veritate 38. The more we try and get into the relationship between these two virtues within our overarching framework of Catholic social teaching, the harder it is to say this is a matter of charity and this is a matter of justice. One reason justice needs charity is that charity often influences or pushes justice by widening the focus to include God and groups of people previously passed over, such as what we saw in the last presentation. These three central virtues, justice, charity, and solidarity, end up being inextricably connected for Christian discipleship and community and peace building. And yet the relationship between them often is hard to parse out. It's a delicate balance, and we never will have uniform agreement as to what that precise balance should mean. And this is where I think, for our current moment, what Pope Francis has been doing is quite helpful. Francis, over the last decade, has emphasized charity and justice as central to the very preaching of the gospel. In Evangelii Gaudium, he explains that the gospel's, quote, first proclamation has immediate moral implications centered on charity. Referencing and using a parasita, he goes on to note that the gospel's mandate of charity encompasses all dimensions of existence, all individuals, all areas of community, all life, all peoples. Where Benedict XVI aimed to get us to think more about the relevance of charity and justice for our economic lives, Pope Francis often highlights the civic and political aspects, including a vocation to politics, and that vocation is not limited just to politicians. Towards the end of The Joy of the Gospel, he says, quote, "Love overflowing with small gestures of mutual care is also civic and political, and it makes itself felt in every action that seeks to build a better world." Kept coming back to that quote when I read the framing of the little acts of goodness and political love for today. In Fratelli Tutti, he develops a theology of political love in contrast to what he diagnoses as our fading sense of belonging within a globalization of indifference and a sense as if working for justice is merely outdated or impossible, aiming at a utopia. By contrast, political love in Fratelli Tutti recognizes that all people are our brothers and sisters, and it tries to demand, quote, "a decisive commitment to devising effective means to this end. Any effort alongside these lines becomes a noble exercise of charity." So political love, good politics, aiming at effectively working for social justice, then always is also an act of charity. Good politics will seek ways of building communities at every level of social life. It is in this working for social justice that Pope Francis envisions politics as one of the highest forms of charity. Thus, we have political love as a particular example of the union between charity and justice. The exercise of charity, or caritas, then, includes not only assisting someone who is suffering, but it is also an act of charity, and this example comes from Fratelli Tutti 186. Even if we do not know the person, to work to change the social conditions that are the cause of their suffering. He goes on to use the example of building a bridge. And when he does that, he's not talking about engineers. He's talking about all the steps that go into allocating the planning, allocating the funding, advocating and working together to get community groups on board with what is it that should be built. Literally, building a bridge in a community is an act of charity by a politician or a civic leader, an example that only makes sense within a context where justice and charity are connected, where political love is a social virtue. Building a bridge or making sure there are sufficient social resources in order that all members of the community's basic needs are met, for example, making sure there is sufficient housing, where everyone is able to flourish and to participate, is the very definition within Catholic social teaching of justice. The 1971 Synod of Bishops document, Justitio in Mundo, or Justice in the World, explains action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constitutive dimension of preaching the gospel. Or as we just saw above in Caritas and Veritate, if I love my neighbor, I am, first of all, just towards them. Political love, then, Political love, then, may be something that incorporates and pushes beyond the simple mandates of justice. It is this that provides a foundation in Francis's conception for the United Nations, and this sense that universal fraternity is possible, that there's something within our humanity that pushes us to want to build community with each other, even with all of the brokenness, even with all of the division. Here it is important to note that charity, whether it be political or personal, is not a mere feeling or gesture or something being kind, but a virtue that requires concrete and sustained action. In Fratelli Tutti, it's emphasized strongly that political love, if it is to be an example of charity, must be effective. It isn't enough to want to do the right thing or have the right intention. He says, for when the good of others is at stake, good intentions are not enough. Concrete efforts must be made to bring about whatever they and their nations need for the sake of their development. Political love and justice is no mere sentiment, and it is always, within Catholic social teaching, includes a preferential love shown to those greatest in need, or as we often call it, the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. Thus, for Catholic social teaching, things like human rights are connected to political love. Similarly, Fratelli Tutti identifies justice as involving, right, so he references the ancient and kind of most basic philosophical definition, to give each their due, as rooting us in a sense that no individual or group can claim that their claim on anything bypasses anyone else's dignity or access, anyone else's due. It helps us see the way in which both charity and justice have to be together if peace is going to be something that's possible. It's also why he talks about memory and truth-telling and this sense that even as we work for peace and forgiveness, it isn't outside of a conception of justice and love. He simply rejects putting those at odds, and that if we've put them at odds, what we've done is misunderstood one or the other. We've either misunderstood what love is calling us or Caritas is asking of us, or we've misunderstood what true justice would be. It is Fratelli Tutti's theme of political love that also seemed to inspire the conference organizers for our reflection here today. While it takes seriously the dark clouds or dark shadows, Fratelli Tutti is a document that embodies the optimism that is both a hallmark of and often something critiqued in Catholic social teaching. Francis deeply believes that we are made for love and that this push or drive, not only for love but for solidarity, is there even when we try and suppress it, even when we try and set up walls. At the same time, however, it isn't something that is possible. It's not properly love or caritas unless we're thinking about justice. When Fratelli Tutti was released, I got a lot of press calls from reporters asking me to comment on what they perceived as something new in the document. And while it would fit in with our theme for today, it wasn't his move towards nonviolence and against just war. What it was that they thought was new and wanted comment on was what the Pope had to say about private property and the universal destiny. I was not the only theologian in the United States to get such inquiries. And regardless of one's political or economic inclinations, from the most progressive to the most conservative free market proponent, all the theologians expressed confusion in their responses when asked about what we thought about the Pope's new thing, the universal destination of goods. As most, or if not all of you already know, it was the least new thing he included in the document itself. He was invoking the Church Fathers and some of Christianity's oldest moral precepts. Why do I raise the universal destination of goods when talking about political love and justice, or charity and justice? because that section gives us a particular window, I think, into the necessary relationship between charity and justice. And I'm quoting Fratelli Tutti here now. As a community, we have an obligation to ensure that every person lives with dignity and has sufficient opportunities for his or her integral development. That's from 118. Quite literally, it is in laying out what justice requires, it is laying out what justice requires in order that political love might be possible. Francis quoted both John Chrysostom and Gregory the Great to accentuate his point here. And I'll just note from St. Gregory, here Francis was quoting Gregory, when we provide the needy with their basic needs, we are giving them what belongs to them, not to us. This framing builds upon what I mentioned from Evangelii Gaudium and what Francis has done mostly when he's talking about solidarity, but it applies here, that solidarity must be lived as the decision to restore to the poor what belongs to them. If much of what we think about as collectively in pop culture as charity is really simply giving justice and restoring to the poor what already belongs to them, we think about this, all of it, differently. Drawing our attention back to the early church is yet another way of emphasizing that the practical necessity of integrating charity and justice. This past week, I was teaching Acts of the Apostles to my first-year students in New York, and they noted this sense of justice and love in the community and wholeness, the sense that they shared all things in common, making sure that all needs were met before you're having any conversation about charity. To fully grasp political love and the requirements of charity, we look back into the tradition, but we must also look forward. And this is where Laudato Si is helpful, as it framed intergenerational solidarity as a basic question of justice, since the world we have received really also belongs to those who follow us. It's not something that we have ownership of, it is simply something that we have care of. Questions of love and justice provoke and invite us to draw upon the moral wisdom of the past, of the tradition, of the communion of saints, but also requires us to think about those who are to come, those who are not yet, as also being included in the scope of this universal destination of goods. And they are also part of a community to whom we have obligations in justice and charity. The broader theme of today on little acts of goodness and political love reminds me as well of what was developed and the reflections on Catholic social teaching they were titled Heal the World, but they were talked about as the COVID catechesis from a series of Wednesdays in the fall of 2020. That Heal the World, in which Pope Francis linked the universal destination of goods to hope. Describing the importance of hope at this moment, theologian Lisa Cahill noted that in the face of the evils of poverty, war, gender-based violence, environmental destruction, Christians must proclaim in deed and word the cosmic span of God's creating power and the transformative possibilities of redemption. Hope, which the Pope linked not only to the universal destination of goods, but to subsidiarity, he notes, above all in moments of change, when single individuals, families, small associations, and local communities are not capable of achieving primary objectives, it is right that the highest level of society, such as the state, should intervene and provide resources necessary to progress. On the other hand, Society's leaders must respect and promote intermediate or lower levels, and this is precisely how the principle of subsidiarity is exercised. Everyone's needs have to have the possibility of assuming their own responsibility in the healing processes of the society in which they are a part. Thinking about how justice and charity are united, how they are related to each other, it really does come down to thinking about how we all participate in the various communities around us. How do we think about all of our relationships? How do we think outside of kind of traditional boxes in which charity is giving to the poor and justice is somehow seen as cold and impersonal? While I do not have time to develop it here, this is part of why I believe that Pope Francis's methodological use of the parable of the Good Samaritan as his theological foundation for Fratelli Tutti is particularly important. It invites us this is what happens when you do not put page numbers on the top of the thing before you ask someone to print it for you. It invites us to think about where we are in the story. And we're never always in the same place. If we re-examine the positionality in the story, we're forced to face and ask, when am I the man on the side of the road? When am I the person who keeps walking? But also, when am I part of the bandit of robbers? That is why the person is on the side of the road in the first place. Not just, am I being the Good Samaritan or not? Am I the one who stops or not? At some point in our lives, each of us is every person in that story. We are the wounded man. We are the person who passes by. We are part of a group of bandits that are responsible. We are part of massive global systems that we don't operate outside of. We are everyone in the story at different points. This reflection on the Good Samaritan in Fratelli Tutti then asks us to think personally and as a community, and in a sense politically, institutionally, of what does it mean to really be in right relationship with our neighbor and with God. It is the universality and particularity of the parable that can help us think through the ways that charity and justice are inextricably linked and are always at the same time both personal and institutional. All of it is more fluid than we tend to give it credit for. I am now almost out of time, but I hope that this foray into the relationship between charity and justice in recent Catholic social teaching helps us to think about the ways that CST, and in particular, where we've been over the last 15 years, can help us imagine a complex unity between charity and justice so that we can try to more fully build communities of belonging and not competition. In Gaudium et Spes, Vatican II summarized it nicely. The obligations of justice and love are fulfilled only if each person contributing to the common good, according to his or her own abilities and the needs of others, also promotes and assists the public and private institutions dedicated to bettering the conditions of human life. Thinking about that summary from Gaudium et Spes, I want to conclude with a practical example of the complex union between charity and justice, which, when appreciated, highlights that the intervention by others is neither is not only personal or political in terms of the state, but also what do we do together as communities. If anybody was in the class, feminist theology class yesterday, you've heard the story of this family. In Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the Daughters of Charity run a number of charity and social programs. Distinctions in the way they talk about their social welfare programs, I think, is revealing for how we think about keeping these together. The Urban Development Project coordinates economic support and training to start up or expand small businesses, among other activities. Sister Tiblitz and her staff noted that women's voice and standing in their household decision-making is often tied to income. Participation, which, as I noted, is a prerequisite for justice in Catholic social teaching, is tied to economics, whether we want it to be or not. Exclusion from the market often also means exclusion from decision-making in the household, in civil society, and in government. With the combination of savings and credit associations and income-generating activities, their target audience is those who don't have access to other kinds of development support. So we're talking about men and women who, what they're trying to do isn't big enough in order to attract the grants or loans or anything from larger NGOs or from the state, and certainly with no real access to traditional banking. In order to participate in the program, they went through entrepreneurship training, and they do a business plan laying out what it is they want to do. In 2016, 420 income generation projects were funded. One staff member, and this is a story from my fieldwork, reported conflict with some of the NGOs that the sisters would get money from because they did not believe that these grants counted as development. They dismissed them as charity. So they were charity, not development, charity, not social justice, because they were not loans, because they were grants. And yet, I want to propose to you today that this kind of program can help us to think through what does it mean to hold charity and justice together, and that maybe what it gives us is pushing against and a broader vision for what social justice and development actually can look like. Mulambet, a woman I met, is a traditional weaver and successful recipient of an income generation grant. Her margin for profit and error is small, especially given when I met her in 2018, then inflation on the cost of thread and different colors was quite a problem. A single mother of 4, the grant allowed her to expand her business, which in turn made possible expanding her house. She sells her scarves at the open market outside the US Embassy because that's where in the city you can get the highest price. One scarf is 3 days of labor. Thanks to her business, though, her own daughters are being educated. Her oldest daughter has graduated from university and works as a water engineer. The second, when I met her, was saving up to do a hairdresser training program because she wanted to open her own salon. The third dreamed of becoming a lawyer, and the youngest looked at me like I had 5 heads when I asked if she knew what she wanted to do when she grew up. All of these dreams possible because of the income generation grant received by their mother. This small infusion made a large difference and highlights the way in which a holistic approach to justice and charity is at once both personal and communal. I would argue that it is in her story we see attention to social justice, meeting the basic needs of a woman and her children who do not have access on their own to wider social welfare supports, the market, the banks, education systems. But it is also an example where the motivation and grounding in caritas, in charity, propels a different vision that allows us to see what she needs, what her development would look like, what justice requires, differently than the limitations of secular culture and the way we tend in a neoliberal capitalist vision of economic development to frame the question in the first place. Cases like hers provide an example of what St. Vincent de Paul called charity embracing justice. And I end with her story as a practical example of what, on the ground, the complex union of charity and justice that I think is envisioned by Catholic social teaching and outlined by Pope Francis and Pope Benedict can look like in real life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clark, for this lecture in which we learned a lot, I think, about Catholic social teaching and especially about how justice and charity go together in a complex union, and how we don't have to think in terms of competition in this way. Thank you also for challenging us to think about where we are ourselves in the story. We can do that maybe or exchange during the coffee break, which is taking place now, only shortly, because we want to be here back at 4 p.m. So we have about 10 minutes, I think, but the coffee break is here next to us. So please enjoy, and then we'll come back for the last lecture of today by Professor de Tavernier.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I hope that was okay.
Okay, it's okay. Yeah, at the moment I was thinking to justice and peace. The question of we're doing this.
Elizabeth.
there.
Staat nu klaar met die foto's? Okay, so we can start again. And before I start, to say important content-related issues, one practical thing, there's a little box, and normally each of you should have a paper which is an evaluation form. We would like you to drop your evaluation in that box immediately after you leave this room, when you will join us for a reception, but you can already start thinking and completing the form now while listening. I guess by the time Professor de Tavernier starts his lectures, that will be done. Okay, then it's time for a formal thank you right now. I'll first introduce Professor de Tavernier for those who don't know him, which is basically a formality, I think, and then we'll say thank you once again. So, Professor de Tavernier studied theology, and he wrote his PhD with Roger Burggraven. His name has been mentioned quite a few times already today, about Christian ethics. And then in 1990, he became a professor at the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies, and as most of you know, I think he ended his career with being the dean for 4 years, and that was ended in the summer of 2022. But he's still teaching and doing quite a bit of research and all the other things he liked to do during his career. And these things were very diverse. He focused on ethics and ethics in general, theological ethics, fundamental ethics, but also environmental ethics, and of course, peace ethics. And then in 1986, so before he was a professor here, he founded, together with Roger Burggraven, the Center for Peace Ethics. And then later on, Didier Polleveit joined that center, and then many years later, me as well, and Professor Jan de Volder, and Jacques Haars, and too. And then, many congresses, many conferences have been organized. We have been thinking together, especially with Pax Christi. Johannes is here as well, and he was involved, I think, for all these years as well. We just want to say thank you by giving a little gift to you. That's what you probably didn't expect, as there have been so many things being done already. So maybe you can stand already first, and then I'll explain why you stand, because otherwise we don't have beautiful pictures. So it's the same idea as the colleagues had when they wrote or they edited an issue of Louvain Studies. We know that you're very much interested in sports, but this time no academic reading, no writing, but just a bon of Vermerk. Okay, I guess nobody knows, but he knows what I'm saying. Vermerk is a very famous sport shops where they sell t-shirts for cycling and for running, and as we know that our dean, our previous dean likes this, our actual coordinator of the Center for Peace Ethics will now give him this little present as a kind of thank you. Okay, so then it's only time to listen to Professor de Tavernier with his lecture, Dona Nobis Pacem, Justice and Peace, Challenges for a Future Christian Peace Ethics. I give you the floor.
So, good friends, dear colleagues, dear students, good afternoon. Dona Nobis Pacem, Justice and Peace, Challenges for a Future Christian Peace Ethics. See if it works, yes. We lived with my family, my parents, 3 kilometers from Tijnkot Cemetery in Passendale, Zonnebeke. Memory to the Great War, 1914-1918. The landscape there is dotted with larger and smaller British and Belgian cemeteries. The Germans are gathered in the so-called comrades' graves in Langemark, also called Studentenfriedhof, and Vlasdro. There is a daily last post, the salute to the fallen under the Meneport in Wipers at 8 o'clock in the evening. Against this background, you can understand why Roger Burggraven and myself, Roger, is from Passendale. Hey, Roger. Started the Center for Peace, Theology and Ethics long ago. And afterwards, also the reason why Didier Polleveit, the present director, who is from Moorsele, joined us. And Jo Hanses, where is Jo? Jo, from Hullehem. We are all familiar with this picture. Pope Francis wrestles with the church tradition on war and peace. His great example, the laughing Pope John XXIII, no longer considered war, now 60 years ago, as an appropriate means of settling conflicts. The horror of the 2 world wars, especially the mass slaughter in both the Great War, about 10 million military, and the Second World War, about 72 million dead, 25 million military, 47 million civilians, were still fresh in his mind. The tapestry bombing and raids by both the Luftwaffe on London and by the Royal Air Force with the Spitfires and the US Air Force on German cities, but also on Mortsel, Achterhewaard. There is an interesting letter from May 1944 from Cardinal van Rooij to the British Prime Minister and the American President protesting against these raids on Belgian cities. Fresh streams of blood each time. The devastating power of the 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 and the arms race during the Cold War in the 50s made John XXIII decide to come to the conclusion, war no more. And in a similar way, Pope Francis brings to memory the dark side of war, time after time, again and again. Millions of refugees, thousands of loved ones killed, children robbed of their childhood, and an enormous destruction. In other words, war is an abomination. The debate on an ethics of war and peace in Christian circles is best characterized as an ellipsis with 2 foci, justice and peace. On the one hand, there is the idea of a just war, which through Cicero has influenced Augustine and Aquinas and puts forward criteria regarding the jus ad bellum, just cause, reasonable chance of success, legitimate authority, right intention, last resort, proportionality. And next to the jus ad bellum, there is also the jus in bello, discrimination between military and civilians, proportional means. That's one tradition. But on the other hand, there is also an important tradition of principled non-violence on biblical grounds, in which conflict prevention, non-violent resistance, resilience, and solutions in which diplomacy, dialogue, and human rights are important or central. With Pacem in Terris, the encyclical of Pope John the 23rd, the emphasis shifts to the second focus. John the 23rd invites all people of goodwill to devote themselves to conflict prevention and to seek non-violent conflict solutions. In Protestant theology, that's coming, we'll come back to that. In Protestant theology, you have a double trend at this moment. Some defend the principled pacifist position, often in circles of scholars who studied with the Duke theologian still alive, Stanley Hauerwas, and his promoter, who was once on the invitation of Roger and I in a seminar here in Leuven. I've never had. This is more than, it's nearby 40 years ago. We invited the Mennonite theologian John Howard Yoder, The Politics of Jesus. I can assure you, all these successors of that tradition, Lederach, Kazangole, Gutter, Samuel Wells, and so on, they are interested in pacifism. Right? That's the one trend in Protestant theology. But other Protestant theologians still see war as a God-given political tool that may be used and continue to swear by a broad interpretation of just war thinking. The most recent example is Oxford theologian Nigel Biggar, comes from Trinity College in Dublin. Dus that's completely, the Protestant world is divided with regard to peace and war. In Catholic circles, one is concentrating on an ethics of just peace and the importance of peace building. Here you see the book. It's not from Blessed Are the Peacemakers, from Lisa Cahill. The subtitle is de facto a better formulation of what you will find in the book. Pacifism, just war, and peace building. Committed to conflict prevention in both interstate and intrastate violence, not totally excluding the use of violence. This is an example of the evolution. I will come back to that. Let's see. This is a structure of, I will touch 6 points. I will not read them, but I will come back on these points. So I will start with, because that gives a kind of, that opens again with a fresh mind, the reflection on the position of the Vatican on the war between Russia and the Ukraine. In a recent interview with the Italian newspaper Avvenire, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Kiev, Krivitsky, when asked whether it would be desirable for Pope Francis to visit the Ukraine, replied that the papal visit is now not opportune for security reasons, but also because part of the population has difficulty with the papal position on the war. What is the difficulty? The fact that so far the Pope has not explicitly condemned the Russian invasion and did not explicitly mention the aggressor by name makes him suspect. The colleagues from Lviv, I was a couple of times in Lviv, in the Ukraine, note that Francis does mention Ukraine's right to self-defense, or only very late for the first time, on June 20, while the war started in February, June 2022. And that he emphasizes too much that the proper response to aggression cannot be more armaments, additional sanctions, and strengthening military alliances. Immediately after President Putin's announcement of a special military operation, Pope Francis called for a ceasefire. The Vatican repeatedly says it is willing to facilitate negotiations. A condemnation of the war follows in March 2022, and it is repeated, and there is an evolution in the way it is worded. On March 6, the Vatican contradicts the Russian message as if it were merely a special military operation. They talk about the fratricidal war. The following week, they talk about aggression, and a month later they used the word invasion. But the controversy between the churches in the Ukraine and the Vatican is mainly about the fact that the Vatican does not name the aggressor, and de facto does not refer to Russia or to Putin. At the end of November 22, a riot arises over this during an interview with Pope Francis for an American magazine. The Pope reacts somewhat irritated. When I speak about Ukraine, I speak about the people who are being tortured. If there is a tortured people, then there is always someone who is torturing. Surely it is known who I am condemning. Surely there is no need to put a name and first name on that. Why don't I mention Putin? Because it is not necessary. Everyone knows my position, with Putin or without Putin. November 22. According to Vatican watchers, his reluctance to name the aggressor has to do with the Vatican's tradition of neutrality, to which Cassarolis Ostpolitik, I see Luc here, he knows everything about it, testified during the Cold War, which allowed to safeguard institutional presence in communist territory. In other words, the Vatican does not want to offend too much the Russian Orthodox Church or the Russian people. A similar polity, remember, similar discussion to the regime in Beijing, in China, as evidenced by the contested agreement the Vatican recently reached with the Chinese government on bishops' appointment. I quote again Pope Francis, "As far as China is concerned, I have chosen the path of dialogue." Dialogue, the 5th chapter of Laudato Si. Megan referred to it 5 times. The subtitles in Laudato Si, dialogue. Very important for the Pope. It is slow, sometimes there is a failure, but it also has successes, and I cannot find any other way. And repeatedly, the Pope affirms that he highly values the Russian people and their humanism, referring to Dostoevsky. The Vatican is also committed to not aligning its international stance with the foreign policy of the United States. And in the same line should probably also be understood Francis' position in an interview with the Corriere della Sera on May 3rd, 2022, in which he speaks about NATO's barking at Russia's doors, and characterizes the Russian attitude as an anger that I do not know whether it was provoked, but perhaps facilitated by NATO's presence in neighboring countries. In the same interview, when asked whether it is morally justified to supply arms to support Ukraine's defense capabilities, the Pope replies that he cannot answer the question. I quote, "I am too far away from it." It is striking how similar his position is to the stance of Antwerp professor in the Belgian context of international politics, Tom Sauer, who has major questions about the dominant scenario in the West that sees Putin as the culprit and therefore wants to arm Ukraine the wrong done. This logic, he says, is very noble, but relies mainly on emotions and values, and often it does not work that way in international politics, Sauer says. It is best to consider buffer states and spheres of influence, and he argues that NATO failed to do so by expanding toward Russia in 3 waves after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I quote, "Despite verbal promises not to do so. Russia feels unsafe, Sauer says. He himself hopes for an alternative scenario, a stalemate on the ground, do not fair, and certainly not what many Ukrainians wish for. Our own KULeuven professor, Steven van Ecke, who teaches European comparative politics at our university, completely disagrees with Sauer. Interstate relations can be organized on the basis of values and principles, because lasting peace is based on justice and respect for human rights. It cannot be dictated by those who feel disrespected. The Ukraine has the right to stand up for its territorial integrity. Moreover, the expansion of NATO was made at the request of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe themselves, which felt threatened by Russia. And Van Ecke concludes, Russia's so-called sense of insecurity is a smokescreen for the real threat to Putin's dictatorship, the internal attraction of a free and prosperous Ukraine. Hence, we cannot stand aside, and Putin may not win the war. In the same line, you must have read this. There is the opinion of, I will not read it, of Herman van Rompuy, expressed in Tertio, following completely Steven van Ecke. There is also recently in the Standard, a couple of days ago, the opinion, two opinions de facto, one of a well-known, he often could get the Standard with an opinion paper, Timothy Garden Ash, the best path to peace is not talks with Putin, but helping Ukraine to win this war. And he concludes, this is a tricky thing, referring to John Paul II, a Polish pope. I see here people from Poland. Fear is a bad counselor, Pope John Paul II used to say. And the message to the West, not just from Ukrainians, but from the Baltic, Estonia, Letland, Latvia, and so on, and East European leaders who know Russia best is be not afraid. And finally, I want to show, I want to come back to the Pope. That's let's say there are also other people. I was referring to Slavoj Žižek, for instance, or Alicia Getchinska, coming from Poland, together with coming from Alexander Skoro-Bogatov, also in the Standard. The more guns we give, the less deaths there will be. Zizek. That's, yeah. You see, it's yeah. Okay. Coming back to the Pope. The Pope does constantly stress that the proper response to aggression cannot be, as I have said, more armaments, additional sanctions, strengthening military alliances. In his interview with Tela, Argentina's official news agency, on the 20th of June last year, he acknowledges, perhaps for the first time, that there is a right to self-defense in war. But he also puts it in perspective. I quote, "I think it is time to rethink the concept of just war. A war may be just, and there is a right to defend oneself, but we need to rethink the way the concept is used today." In September 22, Pope Francis goes a step further by saying that the arming of Ukraine, and I quote, can be morally justified, morally acceptable, if it meets the many moral conditions we can talk about it. But it can also be immoral if violence is fueled by the intention of provoking war or selling more arms. Defending oneself is not only permissible, but can also be an expression of patriotism. Those who not defend themselves have love. In addition, it is important to note that as early as April, the Secretary of State, Parlin, affirmed that the Ukraine has a legitimate right to self-defense, dus earlier than the Pope said this. And during the his visit in, I have given this quote, during his visit in May 22, Archbishop Paul Gallagher, the Secretary for Relations with State, described Russia as an aggressor. The Pope didn't, and affirms that the Vatican recognizes Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. There are also some, I prepared that, many symbolic actions which are of importance. For instance, the day after the invasion, the Pope unexpectedly stepped into the home of the Russian ambassador to the Holy See without bordering with the usual protocol, and he asked the ambassador to immediately send a message to President Putin with the simple words, please stop, in the name of God, stop this war. He asked Cardinal Parolin to send an invitation to Putin to allow him to visit Moscow, but he was willing to offer anything he could do for starting negotiations, starting a dialogue. Moscow never responded to that invitation. And on November 24, that's 9 months after the start of the war, he writes a letter to express his affection for the Ukrainian people and his sympathy for their suffering. Again, he pays attention to the dark side of the war, millions of refugees, war violence everywhere, and the fear that goes with it, a tremendous destruction of the country. He praises the resistance of the people that do not fall into despair, but stand back. I remember the history of the Ukrainian churches, Christian churches, a noble people of martyrs. He also praises the many volunteers who are willing to share much with those in need and recognizes in them the sacrificial love of God himself. And he sees a parallel with what happens now, with what happened with the Holodomor, an artificial famine organized under Stalin in the 1930s, in which millions of Ukrainians died, which the Pope presents as a genocide. On March 16 last year, the Pope had a 40-minute Zoom meeting with Patriarch Kirill, head of the Russian Orthodox Church. He wanted to convince him to adopt a less militant war rhetoric. Kirill read for 20 minutes a text in which he summed up the main reasons to legitimize the Russian invasion. He defends war, as we know, with his full weight, quoting, "Or whoever gives his life for the fatherland will be with God." He sacralizes war and equates patriotism with the highest form of Christian charity. Kirill does not shy away from big words. This is a metaphysical struggle between the forces of the good and the forces of evil, by which the decadent Western Europe is meant. I quote, "I will struggle for moral principles. I will struggle for the preservation of faith. Is a struggle for the future of humanity, for life in the world. No more, no less. We fight to have human civilization respected." Pope Francis replied, "I don't understand one thing. Brother, surely we are not state clerics. Surely we must speak the language of Jesus and not of politics. Surely we are shepherds of the same holy people of God, and therefore we must seek a path to peace and see the fighting stopped. Wars are always unjust, since it is the people of God who pay." And he concludes the interview he has given with the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera by saying, "Surely a patriarch cannot stoop to play Putin's altar boy." This is a quote, "Putin's altar boy," he said. The two church leaders are calling off a follow-up meeting that was supposed to take place in June last year in Jerusalem, but that never happened. In summary, many Christians in the Ukraine are very uncomfortable with the way the Holy See reacted and continues to react to Russian aggression towards Ukraine. But perhaps there is also a deeper reason why the Vatican is reacting very cautiously. I do think that it has also to do with the evolution in the thinking about war and peace of the Catholic Church and the positioning of Pope Francis in particular. Come to my second point. Other points are shorter. The second point is about the changed face of war, justice and development as new names for peace. What inspired Pope Francis to react in this way? Remember what I have said about Pacem in Terris and John the 23rd. He was very much convinced that war was no longer a responsible means of setting conflict. At the height of the Cold War, especially the global threat to deploy nuclear weapons, I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, he emphasizes in Pacem in Terris the importance of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace, conflict prevention, stopping the arms race, simultaneous reduction of arms stockpiles, and so on. He describes a world order without war, in which states would live together in a harmonious way. In its number 109, John the 23rd expresses his indignation at the enormous waste of money of the arms race, money that cannot be used to combat poverty. He calls for disarmament, for greater respect for human dignity, and declares that nuclear weapons must be prohibited, because it no longer makes sense in these times to claim that war is an appropriate instrument to redress the violation of justice. His call for disarmament and his condemnation of war as a means of seeking justice already marks the end of the classic idea of just war and places conflict prevention and a mutual trust building at the forefront of church peace thinking. But Pacem in Terris does not fundamentally condemn nuclear deterrence per se, but it does condemn the use, not the possession, but the use of nuclear weapons, because these weapons violate the main criterion of the use in bello, namely the distinction between combatants, the military, and non-combatants, civilians, discrimination principle. Weapon systems that do not respect this distinction and thus or always do not discriminate, as we say, or always disproportional and thus unethical. And later popes will also apply this criterion to biological weapons, chemical weapons, landmines, condemning suicide, terrorism, and so on and so on. Thus all weapons who do not discriminate between fighting parties and civilians are seen as disproportional. Commenting on this shift in church thinking on war and peace, Michael Himes, Boston College, informs that the change in direction of Pacem in Terris remains open to very different interpretations. Some see the shift rather in line with Pope Pius XII's stricter vision of a just war, while others see it as radically new and emphasize that John the 23rd actually no longer considers modern warfare desirable. And so, therefore, his questions, why do people continue to choose war as a means of resolving conflict? The people who are a bit familiar with Pacem in Terris knows that Pacem in Terris, the encyclical, is silent on one question, on the right of nation-states to self-defense. And in fact, John the 23rd left it to the Second Vatican Council to take up the issue. However, the council is divided. That means that parliamentaries, while not in detail, not going into detail, a detailed discussion on the tradition of the just war, be it on legitimate defense, parliamentaries, the language of parliamentaries is a kind of, has a prophetic force. It speaks about the elimination of war. It states that we are able to realize peace on earth through mutual trust. Dus the Christian ideal, we would say later on with Ricoeur, the humanly desirable, is well defined, but the questions of struggle remain unanswered. The Council Fathers, Gaudium et Spes, praises those who refrain from the use of force in defense of their rights, provided it can be done without infringing on the rights and obligations of others or of the community. Dus this makes pacifism and the refusal, for instance, of military service valid options for Christians. And at the same time, the Council recognizes the legitimate right of self-defense of nation-state. As long as there is no, this is the key, as there is no competent world authority, there you have the question of the Security Council, United Nations coming up, a world authority that can act with coercive authority in interstate conflict. Use of force by governments is acceptable as a last resort with proportionate means to defend their population in the event of aggression. Populorum Progressio, Paul VI. Paul VI focuses on integral development. He calls on all nations to banish injustice, inequality, poverty, underdevelopment. Development, we would speak nowadays about the SDGs, has become, he is presenting development as the new name for peace. As part of, I want to mention this, as part of his commitment to peace, he introduced for the first time on the 1st of January 1968, the World Peace Day, the 1st of January each year. The Day of Peace is committed to a just and balanced peace. And he points out that peace is not the same as pacifism, that fundamentally rejects any right to self-defense. That distinction has never been fully worked out. So, when he went to the United Nations with a famous message in 1976, he sharply condemned the arms race. It's a danger, it's unjust, it's a form of theft, it's an aberration, it's a mistake, it's a folly, it's a murdering machine. And even when guns are not used, they kill. The insane arms race maintains only a sham peace. Thus the duty is as clear as the diagnosis. The arms race must come to an end. You see, parliamentaries, Gaudium et Spes, Populorum Progressio. You see the, let us say, the evolution in the thinking of the Church. Third point, legitimate self-defense with or without nuclear weapons. Numerous bishops' conferences in the 1980s published letters and statements on pending questions that focused primarily on NATO's heavily contested 1979 double decision. This was about my youth years. I remember it quite well, the beginning of the 1980s, the protest movement in the many manifestations in Brussels. This was a kind of responsive decision taken to Russia's installation of SS-20 missiles. Here you see that this is also an interesting map, the discussion about Sauer and Van Ecke illustrated. On top you have the countries joining the NATO in the year 1990. Just let's say at the occasion 1789, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the situation in 2017. You see that NATO, without making much, but that many countries formerly belonging to the Warsaw Pact joined NATO. Theory of sour in international politics. And also something in the mind of Pope Francis, I believe. Dus the NATO's heavily contested 1979 double decision, which, let us say, invited many bishops' conferences to write interesting literature on that. The most famous is, of course, the American Bishops' Conference with their challenge of peace, God's promise, and our response, strictly following and working out Gaudium et Spes, providing two options. One option, the pacifist position. It's for Christians, it's a free choice. You can opt for pacifism. It's legitimate as a Christian to present yourself in a non-violent way, or to let us say, to embrace non-violence. And at the other hand, legitimate self-defense. The French, the Belgian, and the German bishops, with regard to nuclear deterrence, dus the question of deterrence, their conclusion was, in the present circumstances, a deterrence based on balance can still be considered morally acceptable, certainly not as an end in itself, but as a stage on the path of ever-deepening disarmament, as part of the strategy, legitimate self-defense. The French, the Belgian, and the German bishops see this as a lesser evil. There you have the idea of minus malum, and were in favor of that position. But some theologians as I did my PhD mainly on scalebics with Roger Burggraven, and Jürgen Moltmann, for instance, immediately rejected this position on the basis of the paradox that possession of nuclear weapons without a decision or the decided will to use them cannot deter. And thus the bishops' conference, all bishops' conferences were very divided on the deployability of nuclear weapons. The Americans presented no first use. It will probably again be a discussion, and therefore I'm mentioning it. No first use. The Germans disagree. They are not mentioning, thus they, let us say, they are not against the first use of nuclear weapons. And the French do not speak at all about their nuclear power, nor about possession, nor about use. Thus there was huge, let us say, huge discussion on the first use, second use, by way of answer, and let us say the whole discussion about the fact that, which was for the American bishops following Gaudium et Spes, that deterrence, using nuclear weapons for deterrence, let us say without the intention to use them, because disproportional, that has been clear since Pacem in Terris, that does not make any sense. This is in a short nutshell, let's say, the whole discussion. Well, what happened? This here you have the different, recently, for instance, this is of importance. There was the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, which is the first legally binding international agreement to prohibit nuclear weapons, with the ultimate goal being their total elimination, adopted 2017, and so on. The Belgian Bishops' Conference agreed, thanked Pax Christi for being very operational, together with, let's say, the ICANN, maybe you have heard in 2017, they received the Nobel Prize for Peace for it, the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. The Belgian bishops presented it to the federal government. There is no answer, let us say. There is, they want the Belgian government to sign the treaty. So, To conclude this point, Pope Francis radically does away with these paradoxes in church social thought in his very consistent style. This means that he, after the visit of the bombed city in 1945, the bombed city of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Pope explicitly condemns both the use and the possession of nuclear weapons by any state. He stresses that peace cannot be realized through the threat of total destruction. And he confirms this position in Fratelli Tutti. We are all safe together or no one is saved. Dus that conclusion stopped. Once again, the rediscovery of non-violence. Shortly, the letter of the American bishops provoked a lot of discussions in the Vatican. And our Belgian Cardinal, Jan Schotte, for the people who are familiar with it, played an important role in Rome. And in the presence of the then Cardinal Ratzinger and a delegation of the American bishops, he was proposing, before the publication of the letter, that the following theory. The theory of a just war is the only valid option within the Catholic tradition. The American bishops disagree with it and decide to write in the Challenge of Peace. You could read the text as they present the doctrine of just war and non-violence as different, but interdependent methods of assessing war. They differ in some particular conclusions, but they do share a common premise against the use of force as a means of settling disputes. However, one has not succeeded in properly elaborating this complementary view. So, fifth point, just peace. You remember maybe that at the occasion of the first Gulf War, 1990-1991, our Cardinal Daniels, at that time the president of Pax Christi International, sent out a survey to Catholic universities to figure out what people think about armed military action by a Western coalition intended to restore sovereignty to Kuwait after it was overrun by the Iraqi regime led by dictator Saddam Hussein. Legitimate defense, there you have a classical, very traditional case of a defensive just war. Some responded that the traditional idea of a defensive just war is still valuable. And on the other hand, proponents of non-violence in turn realize that gross violations of human rights sometimes necessitate humanitarian intervention by military means. David Hollebach, for instance, for the first time came up with his principle, the responsibility to protect, which has been taken over by the United Nations and so on. There's the question of, and it's in that discussion that Brian Wicker, together here with let's say, the people of the Centrum for Peace Ethics, developed, and maybe a bit earlier, I do not know exactly, brought up the notion of just peace. Would that not bring a solution to the discussion between just war at one hand and pacifism at the other hand? There's the notion just peace. Just peace takes to heart elements of Christian pacifism, but also considers restoration of minimal justice and offers orientation to evaluate defense strategies. Thus, the traditional legitimacy of self-defense is framed in a just peace narrative that considers Christian pacifism to be contextual and prudent. I will show you in recent documents, for instance, Mary Dennis from Pax Christi International is using the concept, and the concept is now very much promoted by Eileen McCarthy. In recent works, we published that book in the 1990s, since about, let us say, 10 years, the notion is also used by Pope Francis and is used by many theologians. Just peace in replace from just war to just peace, exactly what we intended 15, 20 years ago. But still the question, final point, is valid. Can war still be just and legitimate for Christians? Is the use of violence at all justifiable? During Pope Francis' pontificate, there is a greater focus on conflict prevention. He interweaves his commitment with elements of a just peace. For instance, on the occasion of the World Peace Day in 2014, he mentions the relevance of brotherhood and sisterhood for peace building and conflict prevention, an advance on Fratelli Tutti, 2020. Against the generalized culture of indifference, he places interconnectedness fueled by empathy and concern for the needs of others. Those who view the world with compassion and regard other people primarily as sisters and brothers rather than enemies are open for dialogue and sensitive to injustice. In 2016, there was a famous conference organized by Pax Christi International with the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace at that time, a conference on active non-violence. And in the margins of the conference, they were asking the Pope to dedicate an encyclical to the impact of non-violence in the Catholic Church thinking on war and peace, renouncing the doctrine of just war as a valid strategy for conflict resolution and replacing it by the concept of just peace. For Mary Dennis, for instance, central to peace-building work or active non-violence and working toward dialogue, which expresses the DNA of the Christian tradition. The Church is called upon to do more work on peace-building, peace education, and to deepen its understanding of non-violence. I was lucky to meet a couple of times this bishop, who's very much supportive to Pax Christi, Kevin Downlin, an emeritus South African bishop, a wonderful man, who is very much, I will not read it, but who is indeed asking the same. However, 2016, there is no magisterial rejection of the idea of just war until then, but he adds that no pope after the Second Vatican Council has called a war just. Does you see the evolution in the papal thinking already? Yeah. And he's asking it, why it's time to do that, from just, let us speak about just peace. It's notable, and I want to strengthen, let us say, Pax Christi in her peace work, it's notable that Pope Francis is picking up on these ideas. In his Peace Day message of 2017, he draws attention, I quote the title, "Non-violence as a style of politics for peace." And he is, like John the 23rd, convinced that the use of violence in that letter, in response to aggression, never brings lasting peace. Did Jesus not live a life of non-violence? Did he not invite his disciples to do the same and to love enemies? Non-violence is not passive but active. It employs love to respond to hate, and it invites one to become the voice of voiceless and actively resist injustice. He sees peace building through active non-violence as the natural and necessary complement to the Church's continuous efforts to reduce violence. And he is explicitly referring to the mountain peace texts of Jesus, especially the 8 Beatitudes mentioned in Matthew 5. That could be considered as a handbook on a strategy of peace building. John Howard Roeder, 40 years ago, The Politics of Jesus. Here we are, 2017. Unbelievable. I would never have expected this. Fratelli Tutti. It's not easy to stop the spiral of violence. I just quote one number, the number 258, from all kinds of so-called humanitarian, defensive or preventive pretexts, and even by manipulating information. Second Iraqi war, remember what the British and the Americans did? People easily choose war. In fact, in recent decades, all wars have allegedly been justified. The Catechism of the Catholic Church speaks of the possibility of legitimate self-defense by military power, which implies that strict conditions of moral permissibility must be met. Yet it is easy to fall into an overly broad interpretation of that potential right. In this way, some would also erroneously justify even preemptive attacks. Remember what President Obama, the president we love, said during his receiving the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2009, defending the idea that the preemptive strike should be considered in the Catholic tradition as a just war, as legitimate defense. Thus, in this way, some would also erroneously justify even preemptive attacks or acts of war, which can hardly prevent the harm and disorder inflicted from outweighing the evil to be eliminated. The problem is that since the development of nuclear, chemical, biological weapons, not to mention the enormous growing possibilities offered by new technologies, war has acquired an uncontrollable destructive force, which causes many innocent civilian casualties. There is no doubt that humanity has never before had so much power over itself, and nothing guarantees that it will use it well. We can no longer see war as a solution, John the 23rd, 60 years later, because the risk associated with it will probably always outweigh the supposed benefits. In view of this, it is very difficult today to appeal to the rational criteria worked out in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. Never again war. So, some comments. You can Drew Christensen, this is for theologians, something of interest. He agrees with that. Let us say in the same view, you have the film Im Westen nichts Neues, All Quiet on the Western Front. The film is commented because it's exactly what, let us say, expressing the feeling of the fact that war is always an abomination. So that's, It's in his latest message of 2023 on the 1st of January, he considers the war between Russia and Ukraine like all other conflicts in the world. 600,000 people killed recently in Ethiopia. 600,000. It has been a couple of times in our media, but not much. 600,000 people killed. A setback for all humanity, and calls for an end to any form of war violence because it causes death and poverty and de facto means no more dialogue. Nobody is seeking for a dialogue. Now, for the first time, the Chinese maybe will try to do an effort, but nobody else. Thus the spiral of violence is building up. Such cruelty, after his visit to the war cemeteries in Italy of the First and the Second World War. And I believe that this idea, what I try to explain, explains the Vatican's reservation about the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and is also the reason why the Vatican has only belatedly recognized the right of the Ukrainian people to defend themselves in a military way. So this is the war cemeteries in Italy. Every war leaves our world worse than it was before. War is a failure of politics and of humanity, a shameful capitulation, a stinging defeat before the forces of evil. Kharkiv, Izium, Diepro. This position is heavily criticized also within the Catholic Church. Marcus Vogt from Munich, well-known moral theologian, disagrees. François Mabille, the Secretary General of the Catholic Universities in Paris, completely disagree. Pope Francis' conclusion that all wars are irresponsible shows insufficient geopolitical knowledge. I should ask Jan. He wrote a book about the geopolitics of Pope Francis. Yeah. Okay. Conclusion. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis, in my view, has made an end to the long tradition of a just war, and once that tradition has been overhauled, and wants to replace it by an ethics of peace building, just peace and non-violent action. Because war brings a lot of misery, war is no longer an effective means of resolving conflicts. Some disagree, and are, like Steven van Ecke, who is also committed to the Catholic tradition, he is in favor of keeping the principle of a legitimate defense, which is also mentioned in Fratelli Tutti, but with a lot of conditions, so to say, trying to avoid the spiral of violence. Anyway, a future ethics of peace building, we pay much more attention to dialogue, non-violent communication, the early detection of human rights violations, more diplomatic efforts, strengthening democracy, the fight against digital manipulation of the public sphere, enhancing trustworthy communication. So, my final word, dona nobis pacem. This is, yeah. Herman van Veen sung this at the end, maybe you was there, 3 weeks ago at the end of his performance in the Elisabethzaal in Antwerp. It is reminiscent of the grieving parents of Kate Colwich in Vlaslo, or Willem Vermanderen's 1,000 soldiers. If you pass by their lives in the Westhoek through rain and north winds, you will find the war here. Dona nobis pacem. I would like to thank all colleagues for all these years we worked together for the Center for Peace Ethics. It was very enjoyable. I would like to thank Pax Christi for the inspiring moments. And be sure, I want to illustrate just with the just peace idea that we probably did something. It's time for the next idea, that we did something which has changed, at least something in also which is very important, let's say, for the people coming from India or from Africa, also from countries which do have nuclear weapons, that you are aware, let us say, of these, of what Pope Francis wants to tell us. So thank you very much. Yeah.
So it's my turn to close this Peace Day. I'm Annemarie Gielen of Pax Christi Flanders. Actually, I prepared my final notes in Dutch, so I will try to translate it while I'm reading. So already excuses if it's not going so smooth. But last week, on Thursday, I was at the Peace Vigil in Sint-Truiden, the Peace Vigil, We Need Peace, to answer 2 questions. How did we get in this war in Ukraine, and what are the perspectives to get out of the war? And one element of my answer was little goodness. Because the Peace Vigil in itself was a deed of little goodness. It was not a drip on a hot stove, but it was a strong expression of love for people around. I don't know, naaste liefde in English. It's something like charity, yeah. Love for the people around you, yeah. It's a strong expression of compassion, of humanity, of the right of dignity of every person. It's also a desire for peace, for connectedness with victims of the war. And at the end of this day, I would like to repeat it. A word of goodness is not just a sound or the air that is moving because I speak. It is a deed, it is an act, it's something with consequences. Just as violence has consequences, also goodness has consequences. The people in Ukraine are very strong, holding strong in defending their country, defending the people against the aggression and the violence. People in Ukraine are very competitive. They feel a strong sense of belonging to each other, a strong sense of solidarity since this, let's say, second war started. But in Russia, there is only fear. Fear that paralyzes people. So just before the war started, I mean the second war, because the war started in 2014, there were a lot of people in Ukraine who told me that people were indifferent in Ukraine towards the Russian troops coming. They were indifferent to what would happen and what kind of fate was awaiting them. And people were afraid of this indifference of each other. And when the war started, it suddenly changed and people became helpful, became volunteers, were in solidarity with the victims. They helped preventing looting, they helped preventing corruption and misuse of power. So in that spirit, people in Ukraine get more united. And in Russia, it's totally the opposite. Mothers are waiting silently for their sons and husbands. They have questions, but whom to ask? Family, friends, colleagues, nobody can talk about this war because the propaganda makes you frightened and distrust everybody. All human rights organizations are closed or made seen as enemies of the people. But we also see new initiatives, like the soft power. It's a new movement created 2 days before the Russian invasion in Russia itself, created by mainly women and based upon values like compassion, love, feminine qualities, trust, and already some of them are in prison, but still they continue their work. They see it's very important to make a new society in Russia. Some of them are also chosen politicians, so they are on higher levels and still they stay in the country and want to show that they want to build another society based on love, which is the connection also to the political love we talked about today. Only through love and this interconnectedness, they can build a strength, a power that can fight with the destructive power of the Russian government. Okay. Pope Francis, as it was said, describes political love as the biggest form of love for your people around you. It is to foster justice, to foster a social and political order, and this in the name of common good for everybody. So today we heard a lot of interesting speeches about the little goodness started, and it's fascinating that it was a Russian today, Vasily Grossman, who started, well, not he, but his book of life and faith about a little goodness, and Emmanuel Levinas, also a victim of the Second World War, who developed this concept of little goodness. And it is extremely important as it characterizes what is the essence of man and woman. It is this little goodness in us, inside everybody, that differs us from any other creature on this planet. Mr. Van Gorp took us on a tour in the world of healthcare in Belgium. He points to the danger of looking to patients as people with complaints instead of people with capacities. The system should be aimed at giving life instead of preparing for death. He pleads for a new way, a way built on our commons, on working together, on trust. And Professor Volkaert showed us this morning the importance of taking action in order to restore our relation to nature and the planet. It is meaningful to study, to teach, to act, to think, and to change. And this afternoon, I won't repeat too much, but we heard Dr. Verde and Professor Clark talk about the concept of kindness, of justice, of mercy, compassion, charity, words of 2,500 years ago. Do true justice, do kindness and mercy towards one another. These words are essential, the core of our Christian peace ethics. So at the end of my conclusions, I also would like to thank Johan de Tavernier for all these years that we worked together in this Peace Day, which were always meaningful and qualitative events. As already was said, in 1986, Johan was the co-founder of the Center for Peace Ethics, and since then we had yearly the big and the small Peace Days organized with us, with Pax Christi Flanders. And from these Peace Days came a large number of books, among which one of 93, from Just War to Just Peace. So that is indeed a chapter we are going to continue writing. And Johan was always ready for an open discussion with us, for a fruitful cooperation, for Pax Christi as a Christian and as a peace movement of our times. So thank you. As a gratitude, we want to offer you a peace flag and flowers. So thanks also for the co-organizers of this day, especially Didier Polfeit, who is always bringing us together with his soft hand in the preparations. Thank you all people here today who came to listen to the words of the little goodness and political love. And we hope, of course, that all together we make it happen. We make it happen to more justice and more peace. Before we go for a glass to drink, I also want to ask you to fill in the evaluation form. Thank you, and nice evening, and see you in the reception.